This is a video for my mom. This is the hardest video I think I've ever had to make. In fact, I can guarantee it's the hardest video I've ever had to make. When I say had to make, your first thought may be, why do you have to make it? And I should explain, because I think it's important. I'm not here to garner pity or support or pull a poor me or a woe is me that my mom died. And I want to make that very clear from the outset. This video is for my mom, my mother, who passed away 5 days ago. And ironically, I thought I was past all of this, and I made a video last week about mentioning Buddhism and how life is not suffering. And really that word dukkha meant something different, which is life is unstable or unpredictable. Pick your term. That night after I made that video, I got a phone call from my mother, or rather a text that said, I hate to bother you, but I really need some food. And I'd brought her some holiday meal. She couldn't make it to Thanksgiving because she just wasn't feeling well. And I mentioned that in the video, how my mom had been sick. And this was, a week. The last video I made before that was called Losing a Friend on Your Birthday. And I thought, how much worse can it get? My wife lost her mom a month and a half ago. I lost my friend, and my friend lost his brother just a few weeks ago. And then 5 days ago, my mom calls me, texts me, says she needs something to eat. I brought her over some pears. I gave her some, some canned soup and things, and I fed her some pears. She ate some pudding. We talked, had a nice conversation. And then she told me, for the first time ever, from my mom, whom I love to death, and I feel like it wasn't enough, but she wanted to go to a care home where she could be taken care of. And you'd have to understand, coming from my mom, she was almost as stubborn as I am. And she refused to go see a doctor. She hadn't been feeling well for 6 weeks. Her claim is that she had COVID, and then it had turned into long COVID. We don't know if that's the case yet. But she hadn't been feeling very well at all, and she refused to go see a doctor. And so that night, I went to see her. We had a conversation. She said she was tired, so I said, all right, I love you. Said goodnight. I said, I'm going to look for a place tomorrow so we can get you into a care home. The next morning, I texted her to ask her if she had Medicare. No response. Another text, no response. I figured, well, she hasn't been sleeping well. Chalked it up to chance. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with the details of what happened and how it happened. But let's just say that she finally called back, and when I answered the phone, it wasn't her. Just the pause before the man said, this is so-and-so with the Vancouver Fire Department, or the paramedics, I instantly knew something was wrong. I rushed over there, and she had been gone for a while. She got up in the middle of the night, and let's just say that it wasn't a pretty situation. And I went over there and had to deal with all of that. My brother as well. And she lived in a cottage on someone's property, so it was the end of the month. We had to scramble. So I've been running back and forth from there for the last 5 days, picking up the last of her stuff, cleaning out the place, and I just got back a couple hours ago from finally getting the place clean, getting her deposit back, and then sitting back with piles of my mother's stuff sitting around my house. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on that part of it. I just wanted you to know where I'm coming from. It's so difficult to lose anyone in our life, but to lose a parent can be especially difficult. And many of my subscribers know my father passed away when I was about 15 from carcinoma. And so, where do we go from here? I didn't plan this video out. I didn't even know exactly what to say, but I really wanted to give my mom a proper goodbye. And I made YouTube videos for the last 12 years and talked about every topic known to mankind. Well, known to me, at least at the moments that I make them. anything I can think of, but I have never made a video for my mom. And there's a good reason for that. I don't want to put her on the spot. I make it an effort not to talk about family too much. But sometimes when I'd have a disagreement or a debate with my mom, it would really get me thinking about a certain topic. And then I would make a video which would reflect, hoping she would watch it, because I know she watched my channel. So my hopes are that, Mom, if you're out there in the afterlife, I hope you're watching this video. My mom grew up in Union, Oregon, and met my dad, who was from Chicago, when they were teenagers. And I was just digging through this old yearbook from 1966, and it's got some pretty interesting, the old school stuff. But here's a picture of my mom and my dad when I believe I think she was either a junior or a sophomore. I think it was junior. But anyway, my dad was, I believe, a year older, and his picture wasn't in here. I guess he didn't get his senior picture taken, but at least they had that. And I've got a lot of pictures to go through. My brother and I are going to have to do this together. He's been struggling as much as I have, and we miss you, Mom. We miss you a lot. When my mom and dad had me and then my brother, we lived around the Portland area, lived in Milwaukee and Portland, or not downtown, but Milwaukee and Hillsboro and Estacada, I think, when I was born. I've been to so many places around Portland. We had to move so many times because of different things, but our family stuck together. And then when I was about 12, my parents got divorced. My brother went to live with my mom, and I went to live with my dad. And then a few years later, my dad got cancer. And then my mom moved back in, and my father passed away, and the rest is history. She tried to raise us, and Mom, you did a goddamn good job, I think. My brother and I, we've got our flaws, like everyone, but we both acknowledge them, at least. My brother, I always looked at him as pretty immature, 3 years younger than me, but he left home when he was 15 or 14 or something. I mean, I don't even know if he was that old. I think he might have been like 12. He went off to live and hang out and sell dope with his friends and party out, do whatever he did, blowing glass and making money however he could. And I didn't see him, hardly ever. He'd pop into my mom's house and grab some food, eat all the food in the cupboards, bring his friends over. And, those are good memories. Even though my mom hated it, she'd be like, get the hell out of here, quit eating up all my food. But the thing was, my mom worked for Fred Meyer, which is like Kroger, for years. And even when she got a better job, it was a distributor for Fred Meyer, and she would have to fly around, and she didn't make that much money. And she was never able to really just own her car or to own a home. We were buying a house, and then my dad tried to get a business driving trucks in the 80s, and it failed. And then so he kind of, I guess, forced, as far as my mom said, forced us to kind of have to sell the house and pay off this loan. And all of this really just built up who I am. But this isn't about our family as a whole, but more about my mom. But having to explain how I got to that point, As I got older, my brother had been out of home. I was living with my mom up until, I moved out when I was like 19, but lived with some friends on Hawthorne, then moved out to some other friends, but then they had to move out, so I moved back with my mom for a while. And I'll never forget one time, I got the flu really, really, really bad. I mean, it was like 3 weeks of the flu. And I was laying there on the couch the whole time with my mom, chilling out. We'd watch X-Files together. That's back when it was actually still on. So, mid to late 90s. And just had these great conversations about life. And I'll never forget. It was around that time when I read a book called Behold a Pale Horse. And this is a book it's from William Cooper. It's several conspiracies. The irony is this is not my copy of Behold a Pale Horse. I used to recite all these things I'd learned about the CIA and mind control and MK Ultra, and my mom would just write them off. And fast forward, I moved out a few years later. I met my wife when I was 23, and we moved in together, and we've lived together for the last 25 years ever since. And so my mom, years later, a couple decades later, started to get into things like this, conspiracy theories and how the government manipulates. But by that time, I'd already processed most of this and decided it's just not good for my energy level. Like, I don't doubt that there are conspiracies. There are plenty of them. There are plenty of problems with the world. And yes, we do have to focus on them, but we'd always have these debates where we'd end up fighting about things like, I'd say, I don't care about chemtrails, or I don't care about this. And I was too hard on her. Mom, if you're listening, I was too hard on you. I'm sorry. But at the same time, this is just how it goes with family. We have debates, discussions, and sometimes they get weird. But the reason I grabbed this book is it was in her house and her stack of books. And to explain to my mom, these two books side by side on the shelf was the perfect example. We've got Behold a Pale Horse by William Cooper. We've got Noam Chomsky, Hopes and Prospects. Now, Noam Chomsky is very far left. I'm not going to say this is a far right book, but more conspiratorial minded and focuses a lot on the problems with globalism, socialism, and whatnot. But my mom was not the person that everyone or any individual thought she was. Just like every other human on the planet, she was an individual that had thoughts and hopes and dreams and desires that she just could not express. And I know this because we all do. And you never can really get to know a person. You see, my mom moved around after my dad died. She had a couple boyfriends, but generally lived alone. And when she moved in by herself in this cottage she lived in for the last 7 years or so, she was very isolated. And I kept trying to inspire her to meet people or to go join groups, but it just was not her thing. She didn't want to do it. And it was hard for me to watch her decline as her walking became more difficult. But the thing was, she was 74. I mean, she wasn't that old. But she had an issue with eating, and she started to develop problems, walking, and she got a hip implant, and then she did much better for a while. But she just had kind of failed to thrive. And I really hate to say that, but Mom, I love you so much. If you're out there listening to this in any way, shape, or form, it's okay. And I understand you wanted to go. And I know you didn't want to go at that second that way, but I know that life is funny like that. It is what it is. Everything that, whether you believe in free will or determinism, whether you think fate is fate. I mean, whatever you're fated to. But my mom had become quite spiritual toward the end of her life, and I understood that she was preparing herself, which is probably why I somewhat resisted. She had been listening to a lot of, theology. She was into the Steiner Schools, the Rudolf Steiner, and I was trying to tell her it's many of the same things you hear from like Manly P. Hall, except Manly's way more dry, harder to follow, but it doesn't expect you to be anything or to have any particular belief. And that was the thing I had, the issue I had. And in retrospect, my issue with her taking religion at the end of her life, I realize now why. It wasn't the beliefs. I'm glad she had comfort. It was my belief that she was setting herself up, that she knew that she wanted to die. And, it's frustrating when you have a parent that wants to die. But that's selfish of me. And I know this. Years ago, when I learned about grieving being a selfish act, I was kind of like, what do you mean? It is. And that's okay, though. It's both a selfish act and it's okay. You're not crying for the dead. You're crying for, there may be exceptions. If you believe that, if you're an extremely religious person and you believe in a hell and you think that your loved one went to hell, that would be the exception to the rule. You're like, oh, fuck, they're burning forever. Fortunately, I'm not a religious person, and I believe that when we die, wherever our soul, spirit transfers to, it's very, very arrogant to pretend we know where that might be, how that might be. And the closest I've ever even come to that would be kind of a somewhat out-of-body experience, psychedelic, and can pull that out of you sometimes, but you go, whoa, there is another place. And that was the thing. I've been to other places and felt that out of my body experience, and I wanted to share that with my mom. And I knew that my mom was facing, hardships, and I so wanted to take mushrooms with her, or LSD, and I had been thinking about this after doing more and more research, and not that drugs are the answer to anything, but for end-of-life care, they can be life-changing. And I thought, well, ketamine in larger doses can be an amazing, anxiolytic, antidepressant, and to help you to kind of see things differently. And my intention was to hopefully help her to try one of these things, but she got sicker and I was afraid that she couldn't handle it. And this was, of course, over the last 5 years. But it was also selfish on my part, because if I had planned it out and said, no, I'm going to sit with her and we're going to do this, we could have done it. It would have been fine. But that's regret. And regret doesn't do anybody any good. It never has and never will. The only benefit regret has is to remind you to learn a lesson from every experience you have. I know that no matter when my mother went, I know that no matter what the situation was, I would have still had to deal with the grief and guilt and go through this phase. This is probably the most intense test of my psychological awareness and my emotional intelligence that I've ever faced. Because as I say, 3 people dying in like 2 months, what the hell? Both of our moms dying. I mean, we're like trying to go through stuff in our house, and it's the irony here is that I quit drinking a few weeks ago, and I said I'm gonna, among other things, it was just like these big life changes I was gonna try to make. I said I'm gonna get out of my depression, my funk that I've been in, whether people knew it or not, and fight through all of this. And I was feeling so good. And then, boom, blindsided. And I think, okay, this is another test. I got to get right the fuck back on the horse and keep going. And amazingly, there have been so many synchronicities and coincidences. My brother had quit drinking 5 days before she died. He'd been drinking for a long time too. He's like, it's so weird that I just decided that day. And then to be clear-headed when you're dealing with these situations is extremely important, because no emotion can be obscured by drug use or alcohol. Eventually, you have to pay the piper. You've got to acknowledge what's in there. And fortunately, I've been mentally prepared for this through my past experiences, but also my awareness of, the Ouroboros. Let's put it this way, a lot of people talk big about accepting death and being spiritual and understanding there's another world beyond this world, and then the minute somebody dies, they just freak out and lose it. And hey, that's okay. People have their own way of grieving, but don't pretend like, everything's hunky-dory and great if you're going to completely break down, unless you're willing to acknowledge that we're usually breaking down for ourselves. I don't know. Maybe that's kind of a dick move to point that out, but I could be a dick sometimes. I just want people to be honest with themselves, because I've found it so beneficial to be honest with myself. It's weird because the other night, I think the night after it happened, I was talking to my wife in the garage and I just broke down, just bawling, like, I felt like tears were shooting out of my eyes. But it lasted about 30 seconds to a minute, and then I said, nope. And I pushed it back. And I know it's okay to let it go, but I was not ready yet. And that was the only time I've cried about this, because the same way when my father passed, like a lot of people deal with this stuff, especially men, I will save it, and when I'm at the beach next week with my good bros, I will let it out. I got invited, we invited all of ourselves to my friend's beach house, and he'd lost his dad around the same time I lost my dad, and he lost his mom just a couple years ago. So my other friend, Scoey, had lost his brother a couple weeks ago, and my brother is also going with us. And so we're all going to go do some real mental healing. And so, Mom, if you're out there listening, I want you to know I'm taking your advice to heart. Not your advice, your request. I'm not going to pity or grieve, but I will anyway, because we do. But I'm going to make the best of the rest of my life I'm going to live on your behalf, and I'm going to see the positive in the situation, even though it's damn near impossible. I'm just glad that you could go on your terms without a lot of long-term suffering. And to anyone else out there who's struggling with loss or a relative, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, BetterHelp. I'm totally kidding. Totally kidding. No, I do not call BetterHelp. I think you'd be much better off talking to one close person. And I heard somebody say this earlier. It's hard for people to say, talk to a friend if you have problems, because there's always somebody who's going to say, I don't have a friend. Bullshit. You have somebody that you can talk to. But as I heard someone say earlier, even if you don't have a friend, you probably have somebody out there who considers you a friend. So nurture that shit a little bit for 30 days and see what happens. And I say that out of love, because I think a lot of the times we don't have friends to talk to because we're unwilling to give up a part of ourselves to be honest with other people. And I am damn grateful to have male friends that I can talk to about this. It's important to have shoulders to lean on, or hip bones in that matter, which is kind of a funny side tangent. But my mother had a artificial hip put in several years ago. So I want to let you know, Mom, I requested that the crematorium return your titanium hip to us since it was paid for. I guess they recycle them or, whatnot, but I want to make it into a memorabilia piece. I like to work with metals and wood, and I'll build like maybe a mantelpiece. Maybe my brother and I could split it or something and make something interesting. It sounds morbid, but I'm very in touch with that part of death. I'm the kind of guy who has skulls and stuff and bones and enjoys, the process. I've picked up roadkill carcasses. Well, skeletons. I don't pick up roadkill. Don't get me wrong. But the point is that as nonplussed as I am with death, there's no way around this. I'm going to mourn the hell out of this one. So I guess there's not much more I can say. I mean, I wanted to talk a lot about my mom's life, but my brain's just not in a place where I can really go through that. And I'm hoping to do some sort of a memorial, maybe write something. Maybe I'll do a collection of pictures and like a little story about her life that I can make a YouTube video that I can share with her friends, classmates, people she knew, because that's the issue I'm having. You don't just have to deal with your mom dying. You have to deal with talking to the mortician, the crematorium, arranging all those things, paying for it, contacting all of her friends and letting them know, and then trying to figure out whether to have a service. And this is just something you just go through, of course, but it doesn't make it any easier because you're constantly reminded day in, day out that shit, this happened. So anyway, for what it's worth, keep your chin up, people, and be grateful for what you have. Have some gratitude, man. It goes a long way. Anyway, I'll talk to you later, and love you, Mom. We're an awesome mom, and you put up with our teenage nonsense, and we appreciate it. Peace and love.